Welcome to Powering the Future Within, the podcast where we explore the breakthroughs shaping the future of medtech. I'm Omari, CEO of Resonant Link Medical. Each episode, we speak with founders, engineers, clinicians, and visionaries who are driving the next wave of medical innovation. This is where the future of health takes shape. Let's dive in. Today, I'm excited to welcome Joanna Nathan to the show. Joanna is one of those leaders who has spent her career progressively shaping how medtech moves from concept to clinical reality. She brings deep experience across device development, venture investing, and entrepreneurship. In today's conversation, we'll talk about leadership in medtech, navigating inflection points, and what it really takes to translate promising science into real-world outcomes. Joanna, welcome to Powering the Future Within.
Thanks so much for having me, Omari.
So, Joanna, your career spans venture capital, engineering, and entrepreneurship. What was your path to becoming the co-founder and CEO of Prana Surgical?
Yeah, so my career has really been primarily, in life science innovation. I've had a few boondoggles here and there, but that's primarily been what I've done. So my background is really in bioengineering and translational research, and my career really got started right out of school at the Texas Heart Institute, where the very first kind of procedures in the artificial heart world were done. So I got a really great education being in kind of the translational research realm there. And my very earliest part of my kind of career was focusing on work very close to patients and clinicians. And then from there, I kind of transitioned into the product development world and got to, serve on technical teams and lead technical teams developing kind of early stage medical device technologies. And from there, I kind of went back to business school and transitioned into kind of more of that portfolio management and venture mindset, and learned a lot there through my roles at Mercury Fund and J&J about risk and decision making and how strategics think, how investments are made, and how that all kind of plays together, but ultimately kind of having that portfolio kind of high level approach brought me back to wanting to work on one problem. So it was really great getting to get that kind of experience of being broad and having a portfolio and learning a lot across a bunch of different deals. But just because of kind of some personal experiences and different, what was going on in my life, I realized I wanted to work on something specific to patients and get as close as possible to that as possible. And so my transition into Prana really came from wanting that, hungering for that real world impact and being close to kind of a specific patient problem again.
Right. And that's fascinating. Starting at Texas Heart Institute, I've spent a lot of time there, and they've always been known of being on the front edge, leading an edge of innovation, and also really willing to push boundaries to discover new technologies and approaches that really can transform clinical engagement and clinical intervention. I'm kind of curious, is that, do you think, part of what you would attribute to your intellectual curiosity in terms of exploring a broad range of technologies, even in fields that really haven't been pushed in a very long time?
Yeah, 100%. I think being in that environment and then having a really great mentor specifically there. My boss at the time was an electrophysiologist named Mehdi Razavi, and he had a bunch of different ideas he was working on. Uh, So kind of, by kind of working alongside him, I learned he was an electrophysiologist, so I learned a lot about EP, but his innovation was not limited to that field. It was kind of also interventional cardiology and kind of other adjacencies. But then while I was there, I also met, Billy Cohn, who is now working on Bivacor, which is, an incredible feat of its own. Denton Cooley was still coming to work. He was like he's still coming to work when I was there. So yeah, it was really cool kind of being close to the giants of like the artificial heart world and, learning from them and experiencing kind of how they thought. But yeah, I think it was a wonderful environment. I spent a lot of time there though in the basement, because that's where animal work happens. So I'm happy to be in daylight again. So yeah.
Welcome back to the daylight.
Yeah.
And working with Dr. Cohen, he's an exceptional musician and part-time magician as well. So he must have
Yeah.
had some pretty
Yeah. Yeah, also a car aficionado, so you never know. I still work in the same kind of building, and he has his parking spot up front, and you never know what you're gonna see out there, if it's gonna be the McLaren or some, like I remember there was a Kia Soul parked there once, so it's kind of the full range of cars, so yeah.
really interesting. So turning back to Prana, the mission seems to be somewhat personal to you. What's been some of the inspiration that has really driven you to get involved and to start?
Yeah, so it was personal in kind of a different way. So I don't have a specific personal link to lung cancer, although that now I've met, several patients and family members of patients that have been impacted by it. But really, I think the two things that shaped really how I moved through the world and why I ultimately jumped into Prana were I'm an immigrant and I'm a bereaved mom. And so I think being an immigrant really taught me how to operate without assumptions and that systems aren't necessarily built for you. And I think that was kind of what made me really interested in founding a company and entrepreneurship in general. And then in terms of timing, kind of suddenly and unexpectedly lost my son Lionel in 2021, which is right around, when I started, a few months later is when I started working on Prana. But I think for me and for any parent, losing a child makes you think about time and uncertainty and what really matters, and it just completely transforms your perspective, right? And I remember leaving the hospital, Texas Children's Hospital, death just down the street, and thinking, man, I can't imagine going back to any other kind of work. You know what I mean? Like than the work that we do and the work that we do in med tech of helping patients and their families. And so for me, part of that desire to come back to, how can I really own something that has real world impact, that came from that kind of becoming a bereaved parent and losing my child and realizing that I really want to work on something that could help patients and their families. So I think, in terms of why lung cancer, I'm having, learned about the space through my time at J&J. I was very aware of how long some of these patients have to live in limbo. Just not knowing what the next step is. And that kind of goes back to that immigrant piece of my background. But then I'm also aware that, they very often, especially, and this is changing, but especially lung cancer as it stood for almost 100 years, they would get that diagnosis too late. And so now all of a sudden, this is just a much more progressed disease, and that loss is going to be much more sudden and unexpected. And so I think that really resonated with me and what I felt like I needed to do with my time, as part of kind of my grief and healing process. And that awareness really shows up, I think, in how I have built Prana and kind of lead Prana every day.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds as though you found some healing through being able to help humanity. And I know that's a very kind of broad and heavy concept, but it feels as though the work that we have the opportunity to do to make lives better, to intervene earlier, and ultimately have really good clinical outcomes and allow people to live full and robust lives has some healing component in the work that.
Yeah, definitely. I think though the other piece for me is I also realized, yes, the mission mattered and I had a lot of urgency and I wanted to give patients that clarity. But also a big lesson learned for me was, no job is ever going to love you back, right? So I think creating a team environment and building something from the ground up that was really supportive and respectful and, even in stressful moments was somewhere that people wanted to come to work. So I think what I wanted to do was create a workplace that had that urgency of getting something to patients as quickly as possible, but with care. A place where people can do hard things, but good things without, burning out.
Right. Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that mission definitely matters, but it's necessarily not sufficient, and
Yeah,
culture matters just as much.
exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Are there particular cultural elements that you're proud of having instilled in Prana?
Yeah, I think so. I think, um, we I like being a little bit anti-hustle culture in the sense that I know that that's probably not what a lot of investors want to hear from their founders, but I think the way I think about it is in times of like peace and times when things are going relatively well for a startup. We've been flexible. Um, we've made sure that we're investing in our employees' growth and what directions that they want to grow into, and been, I think, a really fun and exciting workplace and a place where you can kind of come to learn and grow. And then in times of war or in times when things are stressful, I think we're able to reap the benefits of that, because I think at that point, people aren't showing up to work, and people aren't showing and putting in the extra hours and, doing all that because they're afraid they're going to lose a paycheck. They're doing it because, we've built this kind of team uh, cohesion where we want to do it for each other and for getting to kind of our shared mission.
And the speed and pace at which you've been going through the development cycle has been very fast. So you've
Yep.
somehow managed to maintain a very fast pace while keeping a good culture. And we'll talk more about that. But I'd love to talk about the origin story around it's fascinating to me because, as you said, you started with the translational research and sciences, and the origin story seems to also be tied to some tremendous clinical partners. So, just very interested in how the whole story came together.
Yeah, definitely. So this actually originated with my co-founders who are both thoracic surgeons, so clinical co-founders, and they, were each part of kind of the progression of lung cancer surgery, and how it's kind of grown and changed over the years in their own separate ways. But I think they really came up with this out of a frustration with a lack of options for when they did find things early in patients. Historically, if with smaller lung nodules or earlier lesions, what the primary option was really watchful waiting, which is where, patient has to come back every 3, 6 months for imaging to see if it grows. Just because surgery, again, has been more invasive, and so is not necessarily an option you want to take lightly. And so they really came up with this option, doctors Ed Boyle and Rick Fishel, out of a frustration with that being kind of the status quo, and they wanted to, give their patients a safer, earlier option. And so they had brought their idea for how to do that to Billy at J&J, when we were kind of all working together. And it was kind of incubated and built out in partnership with J&J, in kind of internally incubated. And then I worked with JJDC to kind of spin it out into its new co. My co-founders kind of came with me as partners, and so did some of the team members. And yeah, so we now can say clinically that we've been able to do that we've been able to give patients that safer, earlier option that came from that very early kind of original napkin sketch idea that my co-founders had.
That's really, really exciting. I mean, the message to patients around watchful waiting has always been a sort of a curious term. And I know we're always looking to balance risk and benefit. But as soon as we can find things that can benefit at the time of discovery, it just feels like a natural extension that intervention would make sense, obviously assuming that you can mitigate the risks. So it sounds like you've really been focused on that identification has been there. Maybe it could be there even great at a greater extent, but then being able to have something that can simply and with very low risk be able to intervene.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the risk benefit, I think, is that analysis is always done at a population level, right? Of It's done by epidemiologists, and it's done to say what is going to benefit the most number of people. But I think what we're seeing more and more of is patient choice coming into play. And so I think this is where, our technology can kind of intersect with the individual patient and what they want for themselves. Do they want that peace of mind of knowing what's going on, even if there's some risks to the intervention? I think we're giving the patient some of that choice back.
Right. Being able to give the patient a clear benefit of or clear picture of what the risks and benefits are, and then
Right.
enabling them to be a key voice in decision making.
Right.
So stepping into this role, you obviously had a lot of exposure to the technology. It was a spin out, but you launched it in 2022. So far, what's been easier than expected, if anything, and what's been harder?
Yeah, so easier, I would say, compared to some of the other technologies I've worked on, is clinician alignment. So what's been great is, there has been some movement in this field, but it's been pretty stagnant up until the last, I would say, decade. But it was really, I think, when lung cancer screening came online in 2013 or so, that things started to kind of move in this field. So, however, a lot of that is targeted at kind of interventionalists as opposed to surgeons. And so the thoracic surgeons have really been hungry for something. So I think once we were clear about this is the problem in the specific patient population that we want to help, that clinician alignment came really quickly with the thoracic surgeons. There's always going to be, clinicians that say, well, I don't need this. But I think across the board, on average, I think it's been easier than I expected to get that kind of clinician alignment and feedback. Um, and then honestly, I think the ability to attract really, really committed and engaged advisors and investors. I'm not saying it's easy to fundraise, but um, you know,
That would be a first.
yeah, yeah. But I think that the quality of the investors that we've been able to attract and how engaged they are and how um, valuable they are as thought partners and not just a check. That too has been surprisingly easier than I expected. Fundraising is still a grind no matter what. And getting to like that the close is always a grind. But, then on the other side of that, being able to benefit from, not just the dollars, but the advice and the resources and the partnership. That has been a surprising benefit, I guess, of who we partnered with.
Yeah. Has there been anything that's been a little bit harder than you anticipated?
Oh yes, 100%.
Everything else, right?
Yeah. I think oh man, I don't think I will ever do this again, but we had to run processes for the parallel pathing, getting our first in human up and running and submitting our 510(k). And there's a lot of overlap there, but there's a lot that doesn't overlap. So the chaos of running, transitioning to manufacturing and then running sometimes different V&V tests and stuff like that for each was a lot. And we're a small team. There's just six of us, and we drive a lot internally. So that was quite a lot. And then I think, in the last few months, just the complexities once real patients are involved. I think for any team transitioning from phase to phase. So in the last 12 months, we've transitioned from product development to manufacturing to V&V to clinical, and kind of regulatory submission, right? So that's a lot of transitions for a team. Some of whom are doing, not med tech for the first time, but their specific role in med tech for the first time. I think that has been a great learning experience, but yeah, not necessarily the smoothest learning curve.
Yeah, no, running V&V verification, validation as you transition from concept into manufacturing at the same time that you stand up your clinical trial and your clinical organization effort, that in parallel, that kudos to you. That's not easy to do.
Definitely, yeah.
And it's interesting to me that on the easier bucket, you're targeting the thoracic surgeon, so you're not looking to disrupt the treatment pathway for the patient. You're looking to enable it. You're not taking this to a new operator, in other
Right.
words. And so it strikes me that the referral pathway would be the same. So I'm guessing that it would be the clinical oncologist oftentimes that would identify this patient, and then there would be a referral coming into the thoracic surgeon. So could you anticipate some type of need to educate the clinical oncologists that this technology exists so that they're more interested in looking at earlier intervention?
Yeah, I think, lung cancer is very much an interdisciplinary field. So we've seen that that is the most common referral pathway, but we've seen it where the pulmonologist is the primary, person referring, or sometimes in the case of screening, it's actually the primary care physician that screens but ultimately they then refer it to a specialist, but it might be a range of specialists. I think, yeah, definitely partnering closely with pulmonologists and interventional pulmonologists as well as kind of the clinical oncologists is an important part of what we're doing, and we're making sure to kind of have those conversations as well as with interventional radiology, because they're kind of responsible for a specific portion of our procedure as well. So we're really trying to make sure we have all of those clinical perspectives as the table as we're building this product.
Let's talk a little bit more about how the prana system works. I would love to hear some more specifics around it. You're obviously being more minimally invasive, which, theoretically would then enable earlier intervention. Talk to us a little bit about how this system works.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best way to describe it is we've taken the general underlying concepts that exist in electrosurgery, but what we've done is create a novel kind of mechanism of action as far as enabling kind of a single port option in the lung. And so the challenges with minimally invasive surgery in the lung are the ribs, right, are naturally in the way. The other challenge is imaging for the lungs are quite challenging as well. So CT is going to kind of be the ideal option. But not every OR has CT and so on. And so what we've tried to do is create an image guided system that doesn't need kind of constant imaging, but initial imaging for localization, and then excision of the target tissue using kind of existing underlying electrosurgical technologies. So advanced RF for tissue sealing, but the unique aspect being that we can go in and grab that target tissue with a single vector as opposed to needing kind of multiple approaches. It's like if you have a, piece of pepperoni in the middle of a pizza, the approach right now is to use a pizza cutter to go get it, right? So you're cutting all that pizza out. What we've been able to do is create like a circular cutter. So that's an simplification. But that's kind of how I like to think about how we've been able to be more minimally invasive. And so really this technology could be used in a wide variety of applications, but our initial focus is kind of those small pulmonary nodules.
Right. Yes. And so imaging obviously is a critical aspect of what you're doing because you're targeting that pepperoni. You're not going in and excising the whole slice. So to be able to understand exactly where that nodule is really important. Are you finding that you are building technology that rides along on top of current imaging that's advancing, or are there specific advancements in imaging that you're looking to drive yourself?
Yeah, so we have designed it to where it can fit within a couple different workflows because we didn't want to design something that would only work in the, top tier academic centers like tertiary centers. We
Yes.
wanted to design something that would work in the community as well. And so imaging is foundational to the workflow, but what we tried to design is a workflow that would allow that imaging to occur in a separate suite, and then you transfer to the OR, and you can do the rest of the procedure blind. Or, if you're in a hybrid suite, great. Then the whole thing is much shorter and simpler, right? Logistically. But really the reason we wanted to kind of have that first option is if you look out in the community where the vast majority of cancer patients are treated, there's not that many hybrid suites out there. There's not that many cone beam CTs out there, right? So, again, we wanted to make sure we had that optionality of workflow. And maybe a decade from now, every community cancer center will have, a dozen hybrid suites. I don't know. But we know that's not the case today. And so we wanted to make sure to design for an imaging workflow that could work in either setting.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, enabling a technology that can work where the majority of the patients are versus in very specialized areas. And it sounds what you've developed is really a platform technology. And we talk to a lot of entrepreneurs. I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs who are developing a platform And one of the biggest questions always is what's the initial target you go after when you're looking to develop one of these technologies? It can be very expensive and time consuming, and so investors really want to make sure that you can get traction sometimes in a very specific vertical or for a very specific target. And it's clear that you have a platform, but you've narrowed in to begin in lung cancer. Was that always the obvious place to start, or was there some discussion across different therapies or different targets that was had before you landed on lung cancer?
Lung cancer is where we started, but I will say we've tested in a lot of different tissues, and there's probably some places we can go, with a broader clearance, quickly beyond lung. But I think with us again, with the startup, you have to be careful with resourcing. You don't wanna, chase after 25 different things and do and get kind of shallow adoption in each of those, right? So I think, we decided on lung being the right market to go after. Tricky. It's a really challenging, tissue to deal with in general with kind of all of the existing modalities that we use, whether that's ablation, whether it's surgery, whether that's electrocautery. There's a lot of challenges in the lung just being vascularized and having the added challenge of airways as well as vessels, right? So we felt like from a technical perspective, there was something unique we could do there. But then also from a market perspective, we really feel like with screening coming online, this is where the largest need is going to be, in terms of needing more and more options as we find more and more of these nodules. I use a line in my pitch about how screening will kind of bring about this tsunami of small pulmonary nodules. Um, and screening's getting adopted, but we're seeing that start to be true here. We're seeing it in China where screening has been adopted, much earlier and is much more kind of widely adopted now. So we're kind of getting to see it happen now in markets where it was a little bit more of a theory when we got started in 2022, but a few years later, that thesis is starting to flesh itself out.
That's really interesting. And we'll circle back on screening and early diagnosis, but would love to talk a little bit about your clinical path. You started in 2022 formally. You've accelerated very quickly. You've done some things in parallel in terms of transfer to manufacturing. What is your path forward to get to a commercial clearance or approval?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we kind of parallel path the first in human piece and the clearance piece. So we have a submission pending and under review. So we'll see, how that goes. Of course, that's up to kind of FDA review timelines and so on. But the hope would be that we could be, cleared and starting to do, not like a broad commercial launch, but again, some pilot launch and some pilot work to figure out what that commercial launch could look like. And that's really what our Series B will be focused on is continuing to gather clinical data, starting to de-risk the economic story, doing some pilot kind of launch work and kind of putting together more of an evidence package that not just gives us the safety clinical data, but gives us some of the economic data as well. That's going to be important, as we move forward through the kind of the commercialization process.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're balancing a lot of different priorities at the same time. And one of the things that I see quite frequently is that an entrepreneur founder is developing a technology that could go through the 510(k) path for approval or a de novo approval, which generally has a different set of clinical needs than if it's a PMA. But a clearance, 510(k) clearance doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find your technology adopted unless it has the clinical support. So the question is, how do you balance these different needs and think about the regulatory requirements versus the clinical needs versus technical risk when you're thinking about your product roadmap?
Yeah, I don't think you can address all of those risks simultaneously, right? You need to sequence kind of technical and clinical, then regulatory, then reimbursement. But I think it used to be true that you could truly sequence them and they could kind of be phase gates. And now there's a lot more overlap. I think the point where you need kind of the plan in place has shifted earlier and earlier. The market is demanding it, investors are demanding it. And I think, market access can't be just something that you bolt on after clearance and all of that. It's really shaped by how your clinical story comes together over time. And so it's really important to think about, study design and thinking about how that evidence will be used and knowing that not all evidence is going to carry the same weight, even if it's, statistically solid. Some data is about building confidence, some is about checking off a regulatory requirement, some is about, getting the physicians comfortable, and then some is going to be about getting the payers on board. And I think, having a high level plan on how you're going to, get all of that data, and then diving into detail as you kind of get through kind of, the appropriate phases is really important. I also think another thing that I've been thinking about a lot more just with seeing what's happening in pharma and in wellness is patient choice and how that's going to come into play more. I don't know if it's going to come into play for our technology, but I think it's coming for medtech. I think devices have been sheltered from this for a long time, but I think it's coming for us. I think something that I wonder about is patients now know to go in and say, "Hey, I want this drug." A lot of I've been following a lot of the patient advocates in the lung cancer space, and they're smart, right? They read the trials, they read the papers, they know kind of what the different drug combinations do. I think that's eventually going to happen in the device world too. They're going to be reading the trials and reading the papers and saying, I want this TAVR instead of this one, because this one had a different risk profile than this one. And so I think that'll be an interesting evolution for our field as well, is it's not, it's just one more stakeholder to kind of think about as you're building your evidence kind of workflow, and your evidence kind of path and plan.
Right, right. And you recently achieved a major clinical milestone. Why don't you talk to us about what that is?
Yeah, definitely. So we just announced that we have gotten through our first five clinical cases in Australia. So it was a lot of work, like you mentioned. Thank you. We got to, we launched in 2022, and these cases were done actually the week between the week before Thanksgiving through Christmas is when the five cases were done. So it was kind of overlapping with the holidays and so on. But we're very proud of hitting this milestone and of how those cases went. It's an ongoing study, so I can't share too much about endpoints and so on. But I think we're very happy with the outcome, and we're going to continue to enroll a few more patients until we kind of hit, kind of the max that we were approved for. So that was all done in partnership with St. Vincent's in Melbourne, and they've been really excellent partners for us. The only thing I'll complain about is the long flights to Australia. But outside of that, we couldn't have asked for, a better place to kind of have our first clinical experience and a better partner that really was kind of first in human minded. So I think when you're picking your partners for that first clinical experience, it's important that they know it's the first clinical experience, right? And that they know kind of where the expectations should be for that. So, and we found that in our partner there.
Yeah, important to have a fantastic first clinical partner, even if you have to take the long haul from Houston all the way to Melbourne.
Yep.
So, without talking about specific clinical endpoints and those types of things, if you just sort of think longer term, what would clinical success look like for this technology?
Yeah, I think, safety is kind of the basic, if we're looking at like the Maslow's pyramid of clinical data, I guess like safety is like food, like that's a basic need, right? So obviously we're always going to have our eye on that. But then I think very quickly you get to, things like for our cases where we're using our tool as a biopsy tool, like tissue quality and are we getting a diagnosis, things like that start to matter. Um, how quickly is a patient headed home? Did they have to have a chest tube? Has it significantly reduced their length of stay? Was the OR time reduced? How much time did it take from kind of the initial incision to getting the tissue out? These are all kind of the things that we're tracking, and we are tracking them. Some of them with first in human, but again, this is why our Series B will really be about continuing to get broader clinical experience, because it's hard to get kind of statistical significance with, a dozen patients or so.
I love the application of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of priorities, and yeah, safety is definitely right there with food and shelter,
Yeah.
and then you kind of move from there. That's a very interesting way to think about it. So you have these first clinical cases under your belt. You'll continue to get some experiences, and then what's next for the clinical and the development plan?
Yeah, so the hope would be, and of course, we're like I mentioned, we're kind of in conversations with the FDA and under review, but the hope would be to start to get some US experience towards the end of this year, at a handful of sites. So either, as a clinical trial or kind of a limited launch or pilot kind of option. And the hope would be to get, I would say 4 or 5 sites in a couple different cities, and have some diversity in those sites too, like in terms of academic versus community, and start to learn from clinical experiences there. But yeah, the hope would be to get a couple hundred cases under our belt in the next year to 18 months.
Very, very exciting. To be able to then establish the broad applicability of the technology.
Right, exactly.
So we started talking about screening earlier, and you made a really good point. I love this idea of the tsunami of patients that could be addressed with earlier screening. So for this patient population, what does this screening look like?
Yeah, so lung cancer screening right now as it stands, there's a couple different kind of filters. So one is age. So it's 50 to 80 right now in the US. And then the next one is kind of a smoking history. Um, and how recently you quit is part of that smoking history as well. And so those are the patients that are considered high risk, and what it looks like is basically they're supposed to come in every year for a low dose CT. And quite a lot of them end up having something show up on their scan. Not all of them are actionable, but at least with today's technologies, but quite a lot of them end up having something show up on their scan. And so yeah, the hope is, again, we can shift that actionability and provide answers to some of those patients. But what we've also seen is the society meetings, they're pushing for kind of expansion of those screening guidelines. If you look at lung cancer is the number one cancer killer in the US. But if you take away the patients that were never smokers and just focus it on smokers, even that's still the number one cancer killer, but never smokers that died of lung cancer are number 7. So this is a growing thing of more and more cases of lung cancer in people that have never smoked. And so because of that, we're seeing the societies push for kind of expansion of screening guidelines, removal of some of the smoking history pieces, um, expansion to, like, for example, I think East Asian American women are particularly at high risk as never smokers, so expansion to specific patient populations that are higher risk. So I think we're only going to see that denominator of how many patients are eligible for screening continue to grow, and that adoption curve kind of continue to grow as well. So hopefully, what that means is we find these things earlier and earlier, and where they're still kind of at a curative stage, and can address them earlier and earlier.
Okay. So essentially, historically, there's been a narrow number of diagnostic markers that say, come in, we're going to start imaging you. And we're looking at the expansion of that as part of the screening process.
Definitely, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And before 2013, there was no screening whatsoever. So most patients really only came in um, when they're symptomatic, which typically by the time you're symptomatic, you're, you know, in a later stage, unfortunately.
Interesting. So then the pure outcome would be additional screening, additional identification, earlier diagnosis, and
Yeah.
potentially the application of technologies like Pranas.
Yeah, definitely. And we've already seen that shift just in the last decade. We've seen the shift of, I think it's 25% more patients are now found in early stages, even just in a few years of screening. So hopefully that, we see what happened in breast cancer when mammography came online or prostate or so on. And we're able to kind of shift again that patient population from stage 3 and stage 4 being primarily where people are found to stage 1 and 2 where it can be kind of a managed chronic disease as opposed to, progressed kind of disease state.
Right. Yeah. A near universal truth in oncology seems to be if you're able to catch, identify early, intervene early without risk, so with a reasonable safety profile, you'll have better outcomes.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to turn the conversation back to your experience as a founder. What are some of the misconceptions that you think founders might have about bringing med tech innovations to market? And do you have a couple pieces of advice for someone who maybe has worked with clinical partners before and is considering becoming a founder or working on a medical innovation?
Yeah. I think my team and I just did like an exercise yesterday where we put on a whiteboard all our lessons learned for the last year. But it was interesting because sometimes it was a lot of contrasting things. Like some of the things lessons learned were opposites, and so I think lessons learned for me are you know there you have to get comfortable with where you stand on the risk reward profile. So I think in startups, especially in medtech startups, but if you zoom out and look at startups in general, when you're not dealing with the human body, it's totally fine to move at the speed of light and, just move fast break things, right? But that's not what we're dealing with. And so that's where I think uniquely in medtech startups have to figure out what the right risk reward profile is as a founder that you want to build your team and culture and technology around. And that's not an easy or, one size fits all answer. But I think that is kind of the most challenging thing I deal with thematically across the board is, making that choice between kind of moving fast and continuing down the path, and taking the risk to do that, versus like holding back, and, taking some time to think or doing more work or doing more de-risking. And striking that balance is the hardest thing I think you have to do strategically as a founder, and it's not an easy decision. Um, so I think the common misconception there might be that there's kind of a set path. You raise your round and then you do animal work and then you do first in human and it's kind of, but it's not really a straight line at all. There's kind of all of these points where you could curve off into a different, outcome. And so I think having that risk reward profile in mind and deciding what that looks like for you and deciding what I think especially if you're in this transition to kind of clinical and doing those first patients, like what level of risk you're going to be comfortable with accepting ethically, because to some extent there's no way you can have zero risk, right? With new medical technology, but figuring that out, uh, you know, deciding what that looks like for you before you get started, and then revising kind of the level of detail around that is a really important thing to do, I think. Um, and then, I think another thing is willingness to kind of revisit choices and decisions along the way, as well as something that we have learned a lot about. So, just because you decided something wasn't important or something wasn't, something that you needed to do, um, it's important to be able to go back and look at that and decide, actually we do need to do this before we transition into patients and so on. So I know I'm talking in very kind of generic terms, but it's tough because so much of this is like technology specific and startup specific and specific to kind of the problem that you're dealing with.
Right.
Uh,
Well, and a
but
lot of it is that balance that you mentioned at the beginning, which is being mission driven and wanting to have a clear and quick impact, but also being culturally minded in terms of understanding that we can't move too quickly, and we have to work within guardrails and within certain parameters to make sure that there's sustainability and that we're not taking too much risk, and that the burden of clinical impact appears to be outweighing the amount of risk you're taking and moving forward. So you're
Right.
right. I mean, it's a challenge as a founder and as a leader to always be considering and balancing those items in mind, keeping those items in mind. But if
Yeah.
you over index in one direction or another, that's where you can sometimes run into trouble.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other common misconception is it's not what it looks like when when you see a founder pitching on stage. That's like that's like, coming out to walk out music and getting to tell the story in front of like a big room. That's like, 10% of what I do. So much of what I do is just like there were so many days that I was like huddled like in a blanket in the conference room for hour number 8, like of looking at some document or some spreadsheet, and my vision is kind of glazing over. And that's a lot of what especially at these early stages, that's a lot of what being a founder is like. Like fundraising is really exciting. Being out there talking to folks, networking, that's all really exciting. But I think at this stage, especially where there's, a handful of people working with you, you also have to come back and be an operator. And so that's I think something that folks or founders, first time founders might miss is you have to figure out how to strike that balance as well of how often are you the fundraiser, and how often, to make sure to make room for being that operator and knowing what's going on with your team and on the ground as well.
Yeah, very critical, if not the most critical aspect of what you're doing. But within that 10%, there is the 10% that having the walkout music and cutting through the noise and getting the attention is an important part of what we do. And to that end, and maybe this is a good one to sort of end on, it seems as though Prana seems to have a very clear brand alignment around the color. I think you all call it Prana purple.
Yep.
What's the story there?
Yeah, so purple was really chosen to stand out, and maybe out of frustration on my part. So one of my side hustles, not with Prana, but with previous startups, was designing decks and brand guidelines and stuff like that for other companies or other startups. And I got really bored with doing basically the same shade of blue for every single company. Sometimes it would be green, or something, but it was basically the same couple shades. And so I really wanted to choose something that would stand out. And purple, if you think about it, is quite a rare color in brand usage. So, there's a Taco Bell, FedEx, there's a couple, but it's not very common. But even in nature, purple dyes historically have been the hardest to find and obtain, which is why they often used to signify royalty and so on. So anyway, I wanted to do something that was unique, and I felt like we were building something that shouldn't be casual or easily replicable. And so I think it reflected, how I wanted our company to show up clinically and culturally in that way as well. And yeah, part intention, part kind of my way of flouting kind of the standard brand colors that are used in our field as well.
Yeah, well, it definitely stands out and it makes a statement and it shows that you're trying to do something new, fresh, and innovative, which I think is a great representation of what you're tackling in a very much needed field. And we will be very excited to watch the future of Prana and the evolution because it is a platform technology. Obviously, the starting point is a very important one, but the application seems to be something that could be used in a number of different fields and areas.
Definitely, yeah.
I really enjoyed the conversation today, Joanna. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us today on Powering the Future Within.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, thank you all for joining us on Powering the Future Within. If this conversation inspired you, follow the show and share it with your medtech community. I'm Omari Bachnight. Stay inspired and keep innovating.